Welcome to Transformation at CIIS. Listen and be transformed. Welcome to Transformation at CIIS. Listen and be transformed. Hi, I'm Damali Robertson, and welcome to Transformation at CIIS. We are here to have conversations about anti-racism and anti-oppression, specifically as it pertains to our community, our CIIS community. And so what you'll hear each time we gather here for Transformation at CIIS is you'll hear different voices, a diversity of voices and perspectives being presented, all within that anti-racist, anti-oppression context. We know that no individual is going to represent an entire group. So each of these conversations are very distinct and really offer the insight and the perspectives of the person or persons that we're talking to. Our first guest is Saoirse Grace, and I am so grateful that Saoirse agreed to talk to us. And Saoirse is an activist, is a student, and really is willing to be vocal. And I really appreciated that about her. As we explored anti-racism and anti-oppression, we spent time talking about whiteness, talking about transphobia, and just sharing Saoirse's unique perspectives within that. I offered a few things, and so we had a really vibrant and rich discussion. When we recorded this conversation, bell hooks had just passed. And so that was up for us. And you could see that if you tune in and really kind of take us in, you'll hear references to bell hooks, her life, her work as an academic luminary. And so, you know, we really worked on bringing that holistic perspective to this conversation. And so I invite you to tune in now to listen to this conversation with Saoirse and I. Thank you. Well, welcome to Transformation at CIIS. We are in conversation with Saoirse Grace today, and I would love for you, Saoirse, to take a moment to introduce yourself, to just tell us who you are, your relationship to CIIS, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, I'm very happy that we can make this work, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm just finishing my 5th semester in the PhD program at the Anthropology and Social Change Department. I just turned in my first comprehensive exam, and I'm waiting on revisions right now. And I've been in the Bay since 2013, and before this, I trained as an attorney, but that didn't. I'm not doing that right now. I'm not a practicing lawyer.
Thank you. And, you know, for those of you who don't know, I'm Damali Robertson, and I am the Assistant Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at CIIS. And I really was interested and curious about Saoirse and her work because since I've been at CIIS, it's become clear to me that there's a gap in belonging, a gap in so much, I think, of where we aspire to be as an institution and where we are. And so I want to talk to members of the community who are doing really, I would say, groundbreaking work. And I heard about your dissertation. And so I want to start there. Just to learn about your dissertation, could you talk a little bit about what that is and what it's going to be? I'm so excited to learn more.
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about it. I talk about it with everybody I can get my hands on. The title of it, the working title, is A Profound State of Homelessness, and it is about the state of non-belonging of white people that is a necessary part of whiteness in pursuit of colonialism and slavery and Orientalist wars. And I'm writing about the sort of like the non-belonging, the homelessness, the emptiness within whiteness and in relation, and I'm using things like critical race theory and ethnic studies departments um, to frame it. And then I'm also sort of uncovering all this through the lens of epistemological nihilism. You know, I cite John Baudrillard probably more than, and Derek Bell probably more than anybody else.
Mm. And it's interesting because I continue to think about uh, whiteness as a framework, in particular in my work, in confronting things like the social construction of race, in confronting things like white privilege. And I know that your work, at one point when we had talked, you had used a phrase that was ending whiteness. And I, was really like, oh, like taken with that
Yeah.
phrasing, especially as someone who would, by all appearances, identify as white. And so, for me, it's like when I think of that, I think there's so much there coming from you. And so I'm curious about a little bit more about, the focus on whiteness and where that comes from. Like, what was your decision to embed that in the work?
Yeah, I am white. I'm not I'm not one of the white people who's like, I'm 1/64th this, that I'm, like you say, the construction of whiteness sort of erases that, the social construction of whiteness. Um, but I think there has been a lot of like materialist analysis um, from people of color about whiteness.
Mhm.
Um, but one of the things um, that a lot of scholars of color, and specifically Black American scholars, have said is that white people need to be doing this too. That the work cannot fall solely on the backs of Black people to rescue every single person from this settler colonial hellscape. And I actually I applied to CIIS wanting to talk about trans people in prison, because that's a thing that I have personal experience with as well. But it just seemed, it's one of those things where you're like, if it sort of demanded to be spoken about, demanded to be written about, and like, who am I to say no to the necessity of like dismantling all of this in pursuit of an end to whiteness?
Mm. And it makes me think of James Baldwin. It makes me think of Bell Hooks. It makes me think of Audre Lorde. Like, as you said, that, a lot of our scholars, Black scholars, scholars of color, have raised that point that it's important for, and I actually just personally agree with that it's important for folks who identify as white to be engaged in this conversation, to be engaged in the practice of ending something that is really harming all of us. I would frame white supremacy culture as something that harms everybody. And so it sounds like that's what you're saying, is you're calling white identified people onto the carpet almost, to say like, you have responsibility. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. Yeah, there's this idea from James Baldwin had this essay on being white and other lies um, that I think was published in the early 80s. But in it, he talks about the idea of he was talking about it in an interview later, but he said the Blackness in America is a condition and whiteness in America is a state of mind.
Mm.
And that's sort of like what started the ball rolling about the idea, not whiteness as a state of mind in the sense that I could just wake up tomorrow and not be white, right? But rather that it is it's a sort of social reality that is created out of whole cloth.
Mhm.
You know, we invented this, we white people invented this as a means of social control, you know, hence the, hence the title. And I also want to say, rest in peace to Bell Hooks, who died very recently.
Yeah. It's so interesting when I saw the headline flash across my social media, kind of, that's honestly, I take my news in kind of very bite-sized pieces, and saw the announcement, and it will just really hit me. It hit me in a place in my heart and my soul and in my body, because she was such a voice and a force. And I was telling someone recently that I actually, when I was in college, which was many years ago, really rejected feminism because I associated feminism with what I perceived as white feminism, as something that rejected kind of cultural nuance. It felt like it was this one thing that it needed. And really, I didn't feel a part of it. And Bell Hooks, I credit her with bringing me back into understanding, Audre Lorde as well, like the power of Black feminism and what it means to recognize the need to dismantle supremacy at all levels, and to really dial into the fact that oppression at any level um, is unacceptable, really, in the space that I reside in. And knowing that as a Black woman, there's something in our intersectionality that allows for that space. And so Bell Hooks, to say I'm not going to tolerate any oppression. And Bell Hooks, I credit her so much. So thank you for raising that in this moment, because it means so much that she had that impact on other people, and it seems on you. So
Yeah, she also, I think a lot about Bell Hooks in not only in substance but also in form, because the way that she wrote, like there are, like, one of the things that I cite a lot is Necropolitics by Mbembe, and that is a very difficult read. Orientalism and a lot of Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak are very difficult sort of academic um, reads, and they're written sort of by and for academics. That's not to say that's not necessary in a lot of times, but that is, Bell Hooks had a different audience, right? Bell Hooks had the audience of anybody,
mhm.
including children. I mean, she wrote about children and for children, um, in ways that I think a lot of people who write about, like the term, what was it, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. A lot of people that write about that don't write with the idea that anybody and everybody can read it. And I think that was one of the really powerful things that she did. And, that's a thing that I try to emulate
Mhm.
in my writing as well.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what's interesting? And I just want to segue and still keep Bell Hooks in the space. Bell Hooks made a lot of people uncomfortable. Like, I've been watching her talks. I've been watching her talks like for the last couple of days, just taking her in, soaking her in. And I realized that when she says, you know, that she, when she calls out white feminists, or she speaks to, you know, patriarchy and all the kind of like all the things that we are up against. People don't often like that. And I recognize that there's a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage ultimately to raise your voice in that way, knowing that you're gonna ruffle feathers in the most extreme way. And you know what? I get that. In talking to you, what I get is that there's a kind of presence that says, I know that some of what I'm saying is going to make folks uncomfortable. And you know what? I still feel called to. Is that how, is that Am I reading that? Because I love to like ask, like, am I getting that correctly?
Yeah. Yes, it's I especially in academia, right? Especially in anthropology departments, which were, explicitly tools, like gruesome tools of colonialism, settler colonialism.
Mm,
Um, I think it's important to um, to confront these things unflinchingly. And also, like, as a trans person, as a trans woman, I'm used to being in spaces where people either didn't want me in the space or don't want me in the space, and or are uncomfortable in being in that space. And that's, I think that's that's a nice thing to come out of all of this. But it's being there anyway and saying what needs to be said anyway,
mm.
especially to white feminists, um, is it's not that it's important, it's that the academy needs to change. you know uh, I don't think that it needs to disappear in the sense of like knowledge production that the academy does needs to disappear, but um, that it needs to shift, and we need to produce new knowledge and new forms of knowledge, challenge these grand narratives that we've had about like pursuit of ideological truth, or objective truth or objective reality. I
Mhm.
think like objectivity just in general.
Yeah. You know, to your point about the academy needing to change, I think this is something that most institutions are up against. And I know from being at CIIS that CIIS is up against that kind of moment of where are we in that shift? Um, you know, if I think back to my years in the academy as a student, um, I certainly didn't, there were certain professors when I was an undergrad that made the curriculum pertinent and connect. And I credit, folks like a professor I had named Sue Houchins, another one named Sid Lamel, another one named Ruthie Gilmore. Like I credit some of them, Lako Tungan. I'm just shouting out some of my professors, Masalela, who really brought Marie Denise Shelton. Let me just give shout outs because I guess I had quite a few. And I still had those moments in different courses where it just didn't feel like there was a reflection of my wisdom and knowledge, coming in. And I hear that today from students. Like I hear from students this sense of I'm being taught from an old text. I'm being taught from a place, and frankly, I'm being taught from a white gaze. Like everything is filtered through this thing. And even in particular, I've heard that when it comes to specific to the navigation, I suppose, if, as a faculty member of content that is specific to certain communities and cultures, I find that I'm hearing, oh, that didn't feel like this person really gave it its due. And I wonder, as someone who identifies as trans, but also as someone who is working on a dissertation that really confronts kind of like the old ways of being, what words of wisdom might you have for our faculty? What words of wisdom might you have for the institution?
I don't know if it's up to me to call it wisdom, but I have some suggestions. um,
And just
but
say, I believe wisdom comes from all places. So I am actually one of those people that believes that children have wisdom, the elders have wisdom, the person who we consider homeless has wisdom. I feel like we can pull wisdom. So anyway, so just know that I mean that with, this very like openness to learning.
Well, I'll try to live up to that. Um, the some conversations that I have with people who are criticizing the academy from outside of the academy, which isn't to say that those criticisms are any less valid, will often lump everything together and everyone together. And there's a group called the Afrofuturist Abolitionists of America, who are fantastic, and they're made up almost entirely of Black, queer, and disabled people. And they write very academically, and they said that when we criticize the academy, we have to ensure that we are actually criticizing the structures of power, and to that I say, how many Black professors do I have? How many Indigenous professors do I have? How many trans professors do I have? I don't think I've ever had a trans professor, and I think in like 24th grade or something at this point. I've had a lot of schooling, and so I forget who said it, but somebody said everybody at the New York Times was hired by somebody at the New York Times. And so that's the way that the sort of like institutional legacies of thought continue, and it's true that the mere presence, going back to bell hooks, like the mere presence of a marginalization does not by itself create radicality, radicalness, or like the ability to confront, or the willingness to confront these structures and try to tear them down. But it's a big step in the right direction, like it's not nothing. And so having new faces that have like interesting and challenging things to add to the conversation, but having new faces that don't, that haven't ever sort of personally seen the world through the white gaze, or a cis gaze, or a hetero gaze, is a big step in the right direction.
Yeah. Thank you. Over and over in my life, I've heard that representation matters, and seen what it's done when I've seen the possibility of either being something or learning something from someone that I hadn't expected to, because typically they weren't in those spaces. Really has been transformative and allowed me to dream. And I think there's something beautiful about that too. I want to talk just for a moment about your experience as a trans person at CIIS. Since not only have I kind of anecdotally heard this lack of belonging and this an issue around misgendering and different things that have come up, there's a listening survey and a report that we just released that Rachel, our Chief Diversity Officer, led the work. And in it, there's a glaring gap in belonging in the trans community. And, you touched on your experiences a little bit, but I would love to learn some more about your experiences within the CIIS community as a trans person, and also, what are some of the things that matter most to you in that work, and that creating a place where there is greater belonging for all communities, including the trans community.
Yeah, thank you. I love talking about myself. There's a to sort of link it to having new faces, there is the issue of like, if the university is not prepared to facilitate the the entry and the integration into the faculty and student body of trans people or people of color, then it can like it can backfire, right? Because like if you're inviting people of color into a racist place, you know, like you're not doing them any favors. You know, if you invite trans people into a transphobic place, you're not doing them any favors, doing us any favors. And it's also necessary, you know. So but also like there isn't a place that isn't racist. There isn't an institution that's not racist. You know, there isn't an institution that is not transphobic. And you know, I don't think that my experience of being unintentionally misgendered, or you know, sort of like thoughtful or thoughtless comments, things like that, is remarkably different from the outside world, as it were. In fact, there's a Pete's across the corner from the campus, and they do great. I love going there. They're always like, "Yes, ma'am. What can I have? What can I get you?" But there was, in the beginning, in the first half of this year, there was a huge push, a nationwide push to sort of prevent trans children from playing sports, or to prevent trans people from using the restroom of their gender, or to force them into the restroom of the opposite gender. I know it's not opposite, but you know, the locker rooms operate on a binary system, so this is, you know, the hand that we're dealt. And it was relentless. You know, there were private rights of action in some of the locker room bills that said that if you felt as though you had been in the presence of a trans woman in a locker room, then that counted as the harm, you know, and that you could sue that trans person based on that. And, you know, it's a problem when you're mere presence without doing anything other than the fact that like we are doing gender, all of us, all the time, but like without really doing anything for that to be actionable, you know. And during that whole thing, I actually ended up writing a paper on it, but during that whole thing, at the beginning of each class, we would have a check-in for all of my classes. And from the middle of the semester on, I had 3 classes a week. In every single class, I was able to introduce a different bill that had been introduced that talked about that, you know, that was targeting trans people, whether they were like trans people can't adopt, or trans people can't get changed in the locker room, or you know, trans people can't play on sports teams, so on and so forth. Every single class I was able to introduce a new law without like no repeats. I think by the time I finished writing, by the end of May, it had been more than 130 bills.
And this is across the country?
Across the country. And it was just in 2021.
Wow.
And I felt like a crazy person because I was the only person talking about it. You know, I was the only person who was like, which isn't to say that the people that heard about it weren't like immediately on my side, you know, weren't immediately like, hey, that's messed up, you know, like, are there legislators we can call, or, you know, is this happening locally?
Right.
But I felt like I was the only person in all of my classes who was pushing the issues, bringing it up, who was saying this is happening right now, and it's like millions of dollars in like shadow money and open money behind it, you know, that to sort of like push my very existence back inside, you know, to not allow me or people like me to really participate in civic life at all. And that was frustrating. That was um, that was a whole ordeal, you know, because it shouldn't fall just to me, you know, to be like, this is a problem, and this is a problem facing the CIIS community, you know, more people than you think.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it just strikes me, kind of takes me to what's happening with the critical race theory. Like there's a movement against it at the moment where every day it feels like there's new legislation. It takes me to that place. And it takes me to the place of supremacy again. It reminds me that the context and the culture that we're existing in is a very supremacist culture that says, if you do something that we can't control, we're gonna legislate, and we're gonna like wield that power of supremacy against your freedoms. And the thing that struck me about what you were sharing, things like playing sports, things like using the restroom are freedoms. They're like, this is, I know I have children who played sports or did activities, and that was just something they loved that they wanted to express into. And to think that someone would try to, you know, bar or create obstacles to their freedoms just feels like, for me, like unconscious. It just feels like, who are we? Where is our humanity, our shared humanity in the moment when someone just wants to be themselves and live into that? And so it really, in a lot of ways, breaks my heart, you know, in that moment of, oh, wow, is that where we really are still? And then like fuels the need for these discussions, fuels the need to interrupt and dismantle these things. So you know, for me, I imagine that often our classmates don't know some of these things, and raising it is the first step, you know, and I know that's labor. I know that that has its heaviness for you as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up critical race theory, because I'm personally sort of precious about that term, and I don't think that what the Republicans in these states are trying to ban is actually critical race theory that like Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell and like John Stefanich and Richard Delgado and people like that have, you know, been writing about, because they're all law professors. You know, critical race theory is, you know, sort of unfortunately an elective law school course, among other things. And it ironically is a great way to study what and analyze what is happening in these legislative bills, but it focuses on a legal analysis of social problems, you know, and it's different from the rest of legal analysis, because, you know, it involves things like narratives, like petite narratives, in order to communicate with people without legal training. But like, you know, it is a very useful, specific analytic tool. Um, and that the Republicans call what they're doing, banning critical race theory in like K through 12 schools. They're not banning critical race theory. They're banning any mention of the of you know, racism or racial inequity or racial oppression, or racial history or racialized history, or deracialized history, you know, whichever perspective you want to look at it. Um, it's part of that, it's part of the sort of the myth making that they do, that was also part of like the trans boogeyman myth making that they did in order to generate consensus, um, in pursuit of this like white racial hegemony.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what it makes me think of just how harmful this whole idea of denying what is. You know, when I was growing up, I grew up in our public school system for most of my life, and cannot remember being in a history class that fully represented the truth of American history. Always in these classes where you're learning through the white gaze, where you're learning about the wonders of Abraham Lincoln freeing the slave. You know, you learn these narratives that are not true. So for years we've been in that space. And so I find it remarkable when I see like some of these parents at board meetings, school board meetings, talking about preserving their children and like making their children comfortable when, you know, many of us have been uncomfortable for years learning history. Many of us have felt like, oh, this is clearly not a full representation of this country. And, but power allows for that to become something, like that fear to become a thing. And it makes me think about this conversation we're having, because I think there's so much denial. There's so much as a country where we're refusing to heal. We're refusing to look at things because we're uncomfortable. And we're refusing to hear some of the voices that are saying, hey, listen, you know, if we are here together doing this, we're going to need to make space for each other. We're going to need to make space for bodies of culture, as Resma Menakem calls them, which is the, you know, kind of the word that I prefer over BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. It just feels, and then for trans bodies, for, you know, the many communities of what I call non-normative community, like the non-binary world. And I just feel like America generally is very binary. Like it has like a yes and no, a good and bad, a right and wrong. And if you don't fit in there, we want to silence you. And that's why I think these kinds of conversations are so important, Saoirse. And
Yeah.
I'm grateful for the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. Gosh, I love that. What did you say? Bodies of culture?
Bodies of culture. Mm-hmm.
That one of the things that people have written about in when writing about whiteness and assimilation into whiteness, has been the sort of one of the costs of assimilation into whiteness. It has been culture. You know, you have to give that up in order to assimilate. Which isn't to say that there isn't white culture. You know, like there are specific languages and practices and cultural taboos and things like that, but and food. But yeah, like that's a necessary part of assimilating into whiteness, is like the foregoing of culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man. I feel like we could talk forever. I feel like there's so much more to be said. I love that we had this time together to unpack and talk through some things that I think are important to the CIS community to hold and to be with. Is there anything else that you want to share with us before we close? Is there anything we missed?
Yeah, there's something that I'm sort of adamant about, which is that for white queer people in particular, responding to good faith questions with Google is free, or just Google it, or it's not my job to educate you, things like that, are utterly inappropriate answers. And not only about for questions about queerness. Although, you know, if somebody says like, what does it mean that gender is a social construct? And I respond, just Google it. And they go to Google is not going to give them the answer that I want them to have. Google is not going to give them the answer of, gender is this sort of hyper real, self-referential, self-perpetuating group of signs and reference. It's going to tell them that gender is not a social construct, the biology is destiny, or that trans people are trying to like sneak into restrooms, things like that. But specifically because we are white, I say it's an inappropriate response. It's an inappropriate response for questions that don't have to do with queerness either, because we don't in that way have to justify our own sort of experiences. Like if you were asked, like, what is race, what does it mean that race is a social construct? Like, what sort of right do you have to be Black in public? That's very different from if somebody asks me, what does it mean to be Black in public? What does it mean that race is a social construct? And I have the ability to do that because I'm white, because I'm not hammered in 1,000 different ways. I'm not facing that hammering that Sarah Ahmed talks about. And part of that is the ability to answer that question in a way that honors the like Black thought and Indigenous thought. Because we can, we must. Especially if we call ourselves activists. We can't, like, very last thing. You know who has never turned away somebody looking for information? A white supremacist. No white supremacist has ever said Google is free. They're always willing to take in, young people looking for information who might not know, which way that they want to go. And they sink their claws in by saying, yes, come, I will walk you through this process of assimilation into like overt white supremacy, that ends with either a white hood or, a blue uniform or whatever it ends up being.
Yeah, I mean, such a profound point. And it made me think that I am always open to talking about race as a social construct for that very reason, because I think that from my seat, that has been one of the most damaging things. That race has been one of the most damaging things that we've lived in this country. The creation of this idea of these separate categories. There's definitely distinct cultures, but the category of race was created for a whole very intentional reason. And to your point, so was gender. And gender as a social construction is something that many of us are coming into as human beings who've been like we've been with race, socialized in a certain way. And so I do think it's my responsibility to undo it. And so I welcome anyone who's curious about what it means. So I appreciate your point about, some of us don't get to opt out, like of this kind of conversation, especially if we're activists. And so thank you so much, Saoirse, for like having such an insightful conversation with me today. I do think that these conversations are seeds of change that, we plant them and we let them go, because I don't know who will hear this, who will need to hear this. And I know the people or the individuals that need to will. And so I'm just grateful that you made the time to talk to me today.
I'm very grateful that we were able to do this as well. This has been great.
So thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
All right. And thank you, Ezra, for tech support.
I just want to say that was amazing. I'm very feeling all the emotions right now.
Good.
It was just really amazing watching this and hearing this conversation, and really rejuvenating, and all the yes, right, yes.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
All right. Well, I'll see you all soon, hopefully.
Bye.
Happy holidays, Happy New Year, all the things. Listen and be transformed. 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 Listen and be transformed.